The following pre-recorded program is sponsored by Adams Financial Concepts. Welcome to About Money, a different approach to investing you won't hear anywhere else. Your hosts, the AFC team, Mike, Chris, and Al, are registered investment advisors who have a proven track record of managing long-term investments surpassing the markets. The information shared on the following program is for educational purposes only, and any investment advice given may not be suitable for all investors. And now, here's your AFC team, Mike, Chris, and Al.
And welcome to About Money. We're going to be talking about money. We're going to be talking about China today. They just this year completed their 5-year Congress. Xi Jinping became the leader who took complete control. So if you look at what's happened and where they're headed, his whole purpose, their whole stated purpose, is to replace America economically, worldwide influence, and militarily. So where do they stand on that? How did they even get there? If you look back at China in 1970, they had a GDP of just $90 billion, $92 billion. Tiny. They were backward. They were rural. They were not a significant player in the world. Today, $13 trillion GDP, second only to the United States, a real world power. So how did that happen and what's going on? And we want to talk about that. We want to talk about what's going on, how did they get there, and what the impact will be for investments.
Mike, ironically, this is a funny statistic I read in this book by Stephen Roach. He's a professor of economics at Yale. In 1820, China accounted for a third of the world's GDP. But here's the funny thing. By 1950, it accounted for 4.5%, and the U.S. accounted for 27%.
Yeah. But in 1970, it was a very small GDP.
Right.
Very behind country.
Right. And they went from being, as it says, a third of the world's GDP in 1800s to 4.5 in less than 100 years.
Yeah. Oh. So they turned that around. It began in 1970. And it began with a very concerted effort, and they had a model to do that. They looked to France in 1600s. Louis XIV, Louis, and the Roman numerals are XIV, I like to call him Louis XIV, came to power in 1661. France at that time was a very backward country. They had just crafts. They didn't have any real industries. They'd just been through 3 major wars and 2 minor wars. They owed money to everybody in Europe. They had no mines, and at that time you didn't have paper money. You had to have silver and gold. They had no mines. They didn't have any way to mine money. So what did they do? Louis XIV brought in Jean-Baptiste Colbert. And what they did is institute a thing that would give them economic power, make them one of the greatest economic powers in the world at that time. They began by going out and inducing entrepreneurs from other countries to come to France and build factories. They would do what was called the royal privilege, where they would pay for the factory, where they would bring in, of course, they had cheap labor because they didn't have any industries. They would build dormitories for the people to live in. They offered no taxes, and they guaranteed that the products, every product that was produced, would be sold. And they went out and stole information. In England developed the first steam engine. The French bought one of the very first ones and reverse engineered it to build their own. Through that period of time, they continued to grow and to finance it. What we know now as the Bordeaux region was the Aquitaine, which was mostly swamp. They filled that in. They planted oak trees. They planted wine as well, because the Catholic Church in the eastern part of France controlled the Burgundy region. They wanted to build wine and ship wine outside the country. They built a merchant navy and a merchant marine to sell their products and export their products. It was a model which built, and they, through a building their trade deficit, and for their debts, it was almost a bankruptcy by installments. They reduced their debt. They managed to build a trade deficit that was, or a trade surplus that was very significant to finance the whole thing. That was Jean-Baptiste Colbert. He was very effective, but he was hated by people outside the country and inside the country. He was hated by the Catholic Church because people only got religious holidays off, and he claimed that the Catholic Church had too many religious holidays and they should reduce that so that the workers could work at a greater speed. He encouraged women to get married very, very, very young so that they could produce factory workers. That was Jean-Baptiste Colbert, and it worked. Minimum wages, cheap labor, and guaranteed. They not only had guaranteed, but they had quality control. They sent people around to make sure there was quality production. And if you imported things that were produced in France, you might find yourself in prison or rowing on a galley ship for the king, or actually executed. There were actually 13,000 entrepreneurs who were executed because they imported cotton cloth from another country. Executed because you imported product. That was how they built what would later become the French Empire. It was the model on which China began. Because in 1970, China began the same thing, began to induce companies to come in and produce products in China. Cheap labor. They would build factories, they would build the roads, because the Chinese controlled the banks, they controlled the land, they controlled the infrastructure, the roads, the airports. They controlled it all. And they could set their mind on, we want to do this industry, and they would fund it, and they would bring in technology from overseas. They stole the technology. High-speed trains they brought in from Japan and in the Netherlands, they made a couple improvements and claimed that they were Chinese technology. They sent spies around the world. And if you look at where they were by the early 2000s, 70% of their exports were products built by companies that had come in from overseas. They controlled the land, they controlled the banks and the financing, and it was all centrally geared so that the government would set criteria to build aluminum, to build steel, to build different factories, and the government would fund it. And so, from 1970 to 2012, the economy grew 180-fold, became the second largest country. But something happened in 2012 that began a change, and that was Xi Jinping. From the old build the economy with almost a capitalistic focus in the mercantile system of France, they brought in an idea of rejuvenating China, making it the greatest country in the world. We saw that. 2022, he consolidated power and continued the drive. The drive, 5 years before, in 2017, they came out with the idea of Made in China 2025, in which they wanted to dominate in several industries. They wanted to dominate in medical. They wanted to dominate in computers. They wanted to dominate in telecommunications, in electric vehicles. They wanted to dominate the world in advanced and basic materials. They wanted to dominate the world in mobile devices. They wanted to dominate the world in agricultural machinery, in robotics. What they were really saying is, we want to replace America as a world economic leader. But that wasn't enough. They wanted to rebuild the Silk Road, and they came up with the Belt and Road Initiative, where they wanted to loan money to different countries to upgrade their airports, their ports, their power, and their roads. And they pumped trillions of dollars in, as loans to other countries, loans that they felt in many cases the countries could not repay and the Chinese could repossess. You know, when you look at Hambantota in Sri Lanka, it was the second largest port of Sri Lanka. The Chinese came in and thought they could do a rejuvenation of the port. They did. They pumped in a lot of money. And when Sri Lanka couldn't repay the loans, and they were Chinese companies that did the rejuvenation, China repossessed the port of Hambantota, and a quarter of the Navy was stationed there. That was where they were headed, to dominate the world, and not just economically, but militarily. They wanted to lead the world all the way through. That's where Xi began, and we saw the culmination in 2022 with the Congress, where he consolidated his power by moving Hu Jintao aside. So, where do we stand? We think there's areas to examine that give you insights into what's happening in China, in chips, in real estate, and the internet. And we're going to take each one of those as separate topics, and maybe we'll continue this next week as well to talk about other areas. But we think it's really important to understand what's going on and where we stand, America versus China, or the Western world versus China, because China wants to become self-sufficient and they want to become the leader in the world. Nothing more recognized than the chip war. So don't go away. We're going to dive into this, and Alan, Chris have been studying this in great detail. You want to hear what they have to say? We know where China came from. It was pretty spectacular. Where are they going? That too could be pretty spectacular.
About Money with Mike Adams on AM 1300 The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. About Money with your AFC team, Mike, Chris, and Al on AM 1300 The Answer. For more information, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com.
Welcome back. So I want to take a little bit of time and talk about the pen. There's an old adage that the pen is mightier than 130 years of Chinese innovation. And to some degree, it is true. And I'm not trying to be facetious when I say this. The ballpoint pen, which has been around since 1988, has only recently been able to be fully manufactured in China. Now, when I say this, it's not totally true, right? Because China has been manufacturing the pen for a long time. But what I'm referring to is the tip. That little tip, that actual little ball that moves around in the socket. This has been something that has eluded the Chinese for quite some time. And actually it took until 2017 for them to actually be able to manufacture their own ballpoint pen, the actual tip. And this became a problem a while ago. China, if you have like a Bic pen, or I don't know what other types of pens there are out there, there's all sorts, right? But they decided, what was this, five years before, so about 2012, they decided that we need to stop importing these little tips. There's no reason. We're making the entire thing. We make the plastic casing, the little pieces that go into it, everything. And so they decided in 2012 that they were going to be able to they were going to make it themselves. And just to figure out how to make the ballpoint tip took them 5 years. It wasn't until 2017 that they were actually able to fully manufacture the pen. So why do we say this? Right? Why is it this important to bring up? Well, I think it's, this leads us into our chip segment a little bit. China right now, and a lot of this is news to me, and I'm going to pass this off to Al here in a second, but, China right now can build essentially low-grade chips, right? Most of the chips in the world right now come from China, but very few of them are actually fully manufactured in the same way that I referred to the pen in China. What they can make are the low end, but they can't make these high end, the ones that NVIDIA and Taiwan Semiconductors, these high end chips that they make. And so most of it is relying on Western powers or Western manufacturing. And in fact, and so a lot of them are brought in from overseas.
Taking this back just a little bit, let's just break this down, talking about chips, talking about what happened right? Why they're in the position they're in now with the chip. Why would happen with the chips?
Yeah.
You talk about this. They stole technology, and they did, no question about it. But a lot of American companies and international companies were complicit in what they did, because when the Soviet Union fell, when Reagan was pushing with the Soviet Union fell, and they knew the reason why the Soviet Union fell was better technology, open information, people getting information that they couldn't get before. So the same they thought of China. They thought, oh wait, with the internet exploding, everybody in China is going to have the internet. They're going to know what's going on in the world. They're not going to be stuck in with a backward thinking, because they're going to know what's going on. In China, a billion people have access to the internet. So these companies, one in particular, talked about was Nortel Networks, a Canadian company that actually went bankrupt, and they went into China thinking that they had all these partnerships and that they were going to help them build these factories. They're going to give them access, and there's going to be billions of dollars to be made in China. Well, what the Chinese did is they just, as soon as they got the technology, they copied it, and then they became their biggest competitor.
Yeah, the problem is, they don't do much R&D.
They just steal.
Yeah, and that's
right. So these companies came in with the idea that if you look at just take it to right now, right? What's the biggest competitor to Facebook, TikTok? And so I don't know for sure, but I'm assuming Facebook went into China thinking that we're going to have a huge market in China, and the Chinese just said, okay, we'll just copy the technology, make a few tweaks to it, and make it our own thing.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what they do. That's what they've been doing. So now we come back to where they just said, we're not going to sell anymore. The United States said they're not going to sell any more high-end chips to Chinese companies. We're not going to do that anymore. This is how we got to where we're at.
And like I brought up the pen, it's not something that the Chinese can't just all of a sudden snap their fingers and develop a chip, right? This takes years and years of technology, and when you don't invest in R&D, the majority of the time you either steal this intellectual property, you copy it, or reverse engineer it. I mean, it took them 5 years to create a pen. Could you imagine creating a little 5 nanometer chip? I mean, that's not something that they're going to be able to do, and it's going to prohibit a lot of their growth. It's going to hold them back.
But if you look at what happened, the Chinese have been trying to develop the chips. And you have to think, we talk about chips, and it's a very wide, diverse group of technology. You have a chip in your refrigerator, probably a chip in your toaster. You have chips in your car. You have a chip that runs the robot that puts the lug nuts on your car when it's manufactured. All that chip has to do is figure out with sensors if the tire's corrected, pick up the nut, put it in, and twist it around. That's a pretty simple chip. When you think about the chip that's in your phone or the chip that's in a guided missile, it's much more sophisticated. And you think about the chip that's in your phone and the computing power you had. I'm old enough, I remember when IBM had computers that were as big as the room. They were huge. They were 6 feet tall and 15 feet by 15 feet to do computing. Less computing power than you have in your phone. The reason you have the chips in, as we've made progress, is the chips have become smaller and smaller. Instead of the old technology where you had copper wires that ran in transistors, now you take a picture and you shine the picture on a piece of silicon and you etch it and you make a chip. And you do that, and the chips have become smaller and smaller and smaller and more powerful. And that's where we are today.
And here's the thing, though. I think when the Soviet Union fell and we had all this burgeoning technology coming out, right? After the Soviet Union fell in 89, 90, and all of a sudden we hit the tech boom. And we think, okay, with technology and the vast dissemination of information, no people in a country are going to want to be under some sort of draconian leader like Russia or like what's going on in China now. But China used the technology against its own people and tried to use it around the world. Here's just some numbers. These two companies, Hikvision and Dahua, 40% of the world's surveillance cameras were those two companies, okay? And then another company, they were the world supplier for 95% of the international cables, underwater cables. And they built up an infrastructure system of spying on countries. They had an extensive technology where they could spy on 165 countries with their technology that they'd used. And so the United States government, especially in 2021, came up with some initiatives here. It's called the Clean Network Initiative. And so they got rid of all that stuff, and they got rid of all Chinese cameras. Anything that the government funded, the U.S. government funded, they said, no, we're not going to use any Chinese cameras. And the Trump administration said, and we're not selling them they were barred from selling them any 5G technology. Anything that can contribute to 5G technology, said, no, they can't sell them. So Xi, convinced that he wasn't going to be able to rely on foreign technology, he's now committed $1.4 trillion through 2025 to new equipment and infrastructure to try to get up to 5G, to get to 5G networks.
But what's funny is that this wasn't the first time that they've devoted a lot of money into developing this technology. The China Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund, I'm just going to call it the big fund because that's what everyone knows. It had about $40 billion put into the fund, right? And in earlier 2022, they actually said that the fund has essentially done nothing. And so it's like, okay, well, where did this $40 billion go? Well, all of a sudden, these random small little startups, these small little companies that have no background in developing chip technology, all of a sudden came to fruition and took a bunch of the money. And so they're calling this one of the biggest, what's the word I'm looking for?
Bust?
Bust, fraud, right? That they've ever seen. $40 billion.
And the Chinese government wants to prosecute because they did not achieve what they intended to do. From 2014 to 2019, the money kept going in, but the Chinese didn't get to very small chips. And we're talking about chips that are measured in nanometers, millionths of a meter. And current technology takes you down to under 7 nanometers. That's what they haven't been able to do.
Mm-hmm. And even at 7 nanometers, I mean, that's the analogy that I heard was it's like taking a commercial car and pushing it to Formula One speeds, right? I mean, the 7 nanometers is the absolute limit to what they can currently produce. And there's no more, they can't get any smaller without completely revamping the entire system, the manufacturing system.
Well, and China hasn't even been able to get down. There was a big news that they got down to 7 nanometers, but with old technology, not at scale, not economically. And the move is to get even smaller than 7, down to 2.
Isn't that what we're at right now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Here's a question I posed to you guys. China wants to grow and be this dominant power, right? That's their goal. And I read something in Mr. Roach's book. He says something he calls the middle income gap. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Mm-hmm. Where countries that are economically poor and then try to grow, and they grow at this really fast rate, they get stuck in this gap where they can't grow anymore. He pegs it to about 2005 prices, about $17,000. He said, will they have enough withdrawal to go beyond that? Because right now they're about 1/8 of the United States as far as income.
Yeah.
So
don't go away. We're going to come back and revisit. We've got more to talk about on chips, so don't go away.
About Money continues. Remember the website, adamsfinancialconcepts.com. Here's your AFC team, Mike, Chris, and Al.
So we're talking about chips, and we're going to continue talking about chips because we've talked about, in summary, the issue that China doesn't have the ability to produce very, very small logic chips. They can produce the big chips. That's not an issue. But they don't produce the small logic chips. 90% of those chips are produced in Taiwan and Korea. Those are the key areas of production. So what is it? And what's going on? And what did the Biden administration just do in October? Let's talk about that.
Well, yeah. Well, I will give a lot of credit to Biden. He didn't run away. So for all the bad, for all the things, say what you want about the Trump administration. One thing that they got right was taking it to China, right? And when Biden came into office, he could easily pivoted from that stance and really nuzzled up with them. But to his credit, he has not at all. What Biden recently did is he actually put a direct ban on some of the. So there's really two types of chips. There's memory chips and then there's logic chips. The logic chips are what Biden is really halting from China, because that's what they need in order to make a lot of different cars, military equipment, whole 9 yards. And so he actually created the chip 4. This is still in the works with Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, and obviously the United States to create an international tech ecosystem that essentially blocks out China, but then also has about $52 billion in subsidies for firms that are going to end up making these chips on the U.S. soil. So he's really he's given the middle finger to China on this one. He really is.
I think there's a great quote from The Atlantic that talks about the Chinese Communist Party's 20th Congress wrapped up. And it says that having shoved aside his political rivals, Xi can rule over the world's rising great power virtually uncontested. Yet amid this display of pomp and power, President Joe Biden showed Xi who's boss. 2 days earlier, on October 21, Biden had dropped the hammer on China's semiconductor industry by fully implementing a slew of tough controls on the export of American chip technology to China. It's a painful blow to Xi's ambitions to rival the U.S., delivered at the very moment when the Chinese leader has reached the pinnacle of his political power. So what did he do? He put limits on what technology can go to China.
Yeah, because he's seen what happened in the past, and that's why we're bringing a lot of these chip factories home and making this stuff here. And I haven't read his new book, but I heard this gentleman, Stephen Roach, on NPR talking about that, saying that it is such a huge blow because, as Chris said, it took him 5 years to build the tip of a ballpoint pen. It's probably a 20-year, 30-year project to get up to snuff to where we are with technology to build these micro nano chips, and it's going to take them that long to get there.
Get where we are today, right? And we're continuing to progress. Who's to say, in 20 years when they finally catch up to where we are today in 2022, I mean, where are we going to be,
And why is it, if you look at it, Biden is trying to form what's the chip 4?
Mm-hmm.
Taiwan,
South Korea, Japan,
and the United States, to keep our chip technology, to keep China from developing it and from stealing it. And what does the technology do? It's used in guided missiles. It's used in military equipment. Mm-hmm. It's aviation. It's used in manufacturing and products. It's all the great things that we think about today in terms of artificial intelligence, electric vehicles, all those things that they want to lead the world in requires those chips. And the Biden administration simply blocked them from getting that technology. You can see the importance of why their focus is on Taiwan and why there's fears that they will start a war to develop Taiwan. You have thoughts about that, Chris?
Yeah. Well, we've talked a lot about this off air, but I mean, it makes perfect sense. I mean, if there's an island right off the mainland, just a number of miles, I think 100 miles, maybe not even that. The point is, if there's a little island that can produce all these chips right now, and you already claim it as yours, I mean, to me, it makes sense, especially with what Russia's done with Ukraine right now. I mean, that the timing is right for China, and I pray that that doesn't happen. But if we look at things critically, I mean, it makes sense. You know what? I'll make one more point. If we look back, obviously history is always 2020, but when we look back, there was reports before Putin invaded that he was gearing up at the borders, right? He was sending troops, he was sending tanks, he was sending everything that they would need in order for an invasion. Well, if you look at China right now, they're starting to do the same thing on some of the cities near Taiwan. They're starting to load up those borders. They're running a lot more tests of missiles and invasions and strike fighters, all these different things. And so there's incentive for them to go after Taiwan. But I don't want to steer too far into this. Just something to be aware of.
No, 90% of the top chips are produced in Taiwan and South Korea. But there's also the initiative to move that manufacturing back to the U.S. So the CHIPS Act that was passed by Congress provides up to $52 billion to move things back. Micron has announced a $40 billion package, Intel a $20 billion package. The idea is to bring a lot of the chip technology production back to the U.S. and block China from having access to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a war. It's an economic war that's going on. And the United States has the controls and can block China and the rest of the world. They can block what we're seeing go on in Russia right now. Is a lot of the Russian military technology requires American-made chips or American technology chips.
The other thing, Mike, as we move away from fossil fuel power, getting power to your country is going to be critical, and these chips are going to be a main factor in producing that. And having the infrastructure in place to do that is going to be a big point to have.
Yeah.
I think another, kind of switching gears, obviously the chip is just one segment of what's going on, but what's also really interesting is how China's inflated their balance sheet through real estate. What is it, 25 or 30% of the country's GDP is made up of real estate? Is that correct?
That's correct.
So what we're seeing, and Al's actually the one that has done a deeper dive into this, but people are starting to refuse to actually pay their mortgages. So
I do that sometimes. I lose my notes. I lose my place.
I lost myself.
So essentially, well, I guess we could go back to the beginning, kind of the pre-sold model. There's a rough estimate that about 2 million properties in China right now are essentially pre-sold. And so they're sold 1 to 3 years before anyone actually moves inside of them. And essentially, what's been going on is developers have been buying properties, then getting loans and essentially selling the properties that haven't been built yet to investors. And then with the funds that they're using, they end up going out and buying more properties, and before the current ones are even built. And so now there's this problem that a lot of these properties aren't getting finished. And this was in the news with the Evergrande. So if any of you have read about that, that's exactly what we're referring to. Do you guys have anything to add?
Well, yeah, I mean, when I looked at it, China's kind of like we were back before 2008.
In many ways, yeah.
They're still where the rest of the world is raising interest rates. They're still borrowing money and pumping tons of money into their economy. And with their COVID lockdowns, they're not producing what they were producing, so it's really hurting the country.
And they're doing that in the real estate industry as well. Mm-hmm. The real estate industry is almost a Ponzi scheme. When you think about it, the people are making down payments. You can think about it in Seattle. If you see a new building going up and you buy a condo while it's under construction, and you put your down payment in, and you begin to make payments into it, it's actually giving the builder free money. And the builder then, in China, that's been going on, and the builders then use that money to buy another property and begin building another one. And everything works fine until you reach a peak and things come down. Standard & Poor's estimates it'll take 800 yuan, 800 billion, which is about 120 billion US dollars to correct the problem. And in worst case, $1.2 trillion to get back to a normal situation.
Well, the real problem is they started building these new properties before they had finished ones that they'd already taken money from.
Yeah.
Right. And so when the economy began to slow down and the income was going down, right, they weren't able to finish the projects. And so people have mortgages already. They're paying for this unbuilt house. And now they're like, well, if you guys aren't going to finish it, there's actually a story, back, 6 months ago, people would walk by and there was hundreds of workers. And then, within a week, there was none.
We'll come back to this story right after the commercial break. Don't go away.
We're back, and we're talking about the real estate crisis in China. And one of the major players, the second largest property developer, Evergrande, had their failures had spread throughout the industry, where the government had to pledge 200 billion yuan to kickstart investments. And it's going to take at least 800 billion yuan needed, or even 10 times that much in the worst case scenario, to rescue the property market, which is fallen and could go bust, just like what happened here in 2008.
Oh yeah, and they announced that they were going to default on their debt.
Mm-hmm.
That highlighted the fact of what's going on in the real estate market. You're right to bring it up.
Well, there was this 14 tower project, and it was called the Evergrande Longting, and it had promised to deliver the homes to buyers in 2023, so just a couple of months from now. A few months after hundreds of people began paying their mortgages, home buyers noticed that the construction had actually slowed, and that a lot of the people on the site had dwindled from a few dozen to just a few dozen from hundreds previously. And so after seeing this, investors saw that there's not a lot of people working on their house. They're like, well, if you guys aren't going to complete this on time or even complete it at all, we're just going to go ahead and not pay our mortgages. And so this actually started a kind of a trend on Chinese social media where people went to their local governments, they went to the mortgage companies, they went to Evergrande, and they said, we're not paying.
Yeah, I mean, nearly a third, 29.1%, up from 24.3% last year, is considered bad debt.
How much?
A third, 29.1%.
What was it? What was it in 2008? How much of the how much bad debt was there in the U.S. at that time?
It was not nearly that high.
I think it was only around 10%, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Wow.
And China has 3 times the amount that we had in 2008.
And the alarms aren't sounding yet. and what's incredible to me is that in a country that's basically shut down the internet to outsiders, right? They have such control over it. How they allow these letters and this movement to circulate throughout media.
It's interesting you say that, because of all the people that are online in China. There's almost 1 billion people. And according to what I read, they got on these micro blogs to voice their opinion. Even though the government tries to shut it down, they have code words and things that they use to get around the Chinese security. And so that's one of the things why going back to the chips for a second is so important, because if we want to proliferate democracy in China, it's not going to happen by giving them more technology, because they're only using it against their own people, where they imprisoned 1 million Muslims. So
Uyghurs or something like that. Something along those lines. Yeah.
Imprisonment of 1 million Muslim minorities. So they just imprison people that they don't want to, they don't want to hear from you.
Well,
Re-education camps.
Yeah. Isn't that what Jack Ma went to?
That's right.
One of the wealthiest people in the nation, in the world, just disappears to get re-educated.
So one thing that happened during our crisis is that the Fed stepped in and the Treasury stepped in and put out stimulus. And you can do that to a certain point until your currency becomes more and more devalued. And I believe that's a risk that China faces, is if they bail out the real estate market, if they work on all these other projects, the yuan could become significantly devalued, making imports much more expensive, leading to a huge bout of inflation in China.
And add insult to injury. I mean, these properties that we're referring to not only are not getting completed, but the the market value of them was inflated to, it was actually appalling. Mike, and you had talked about this on previous shows, a number of months ago. The properties in this area, because of the overall housing market, and because they would essentially just come in and build these cities, they had values, similar to what we would have here in Bellevue.
Yeah.
And so there's not like they build this new area and it's not worth anything. On paper, I mean, they had really inflated the property values.
Yeah, but you mentioned that their property values are 30% of China's gross domestic product. Mm-hmm. And, that's a huge portion compared to other industrialized countries of the gross domestic product, to be that much of the gross domestic product.
It's always been a way that the Chinese have thought about investment. Property is a great investment because over the centuries, it doesn't lose value.
Until it does.
Well, it loses short-term value.
Well, that's what we thought right before 2008, right? Properties only go up, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's a significant economic drawdown on China and on Chinese securities. And they're beginning to understand that real estate values going down are beginning to shift investment emphasis from just real estate to equities and to other types of investments.
And what happened last week when Xi consolidated power? What happened to the equities, like the stocks? They all tanked, 10%, some 12% last week.
More, yeah.
And I think that'll continue. I think people are going to be scared to invest in China. The foreign investment's going to be afraid to put his money there.
And that's what some of these articles, this Wall Street Journal article from a number of months ago had said, that this reckless spending and lending, reckless lending has starved developers of their funding. And so now that the music has stopped, people are going to look for safer assets. They're going to look to the equity markets. They're going to look to, anything else other than the real estate.
So that's giving you, the listener, some insight into what's happening in China. There's a lot more that we can talk about, and maybe we will talk about in the next couple programs, but it gives you some insight into our largest national competitor and where they stand and the issues that they're facing. But there's a spillover. If they go into a high inflationary time, it will spill over to the U.S. If they decide to take over Taiwan militarily, there'll be spillover. So it's not something you can just put away and say, oh, China's over there and we're over here. No, you have to be aware of what's going on with the second largest economy in the world, because it will impact us. And so that's the purpose of this program, is to bring you, the listeners, understanding of what's going on in the world of investments, economics, so that you can gear your own portfolios to what's happening there, because it will have spillover here. And we have to be very aware of what's happening there. We will be back with more in the coming weeks, so don't miss us. Stay with us, because if it's Saturday, we will be talking about money.
You've been listening to About Money with registered investment advisors Mike Adams, Chris Yand, and Al Souza. If you'd like more information about what you've heard today, or about AFC's investment philosophy and strategy, or if you'd like the AFC team to evaluate your own portfolio, click on adamsfinancialconcepts.com. That's adamsfinancialconcepts.com. The information shared in the preceding program was for educational purposes